Nearly 40 years after his death, serial killer Ted Bundy has been identified as the killer in another murder. Laura Ann Aim of Utah was just 17 when she vanished on Halloween night in 1974. Her body was found a month later by the side of a highway. Investigators suspected Bundy, and he confessed to killing her before he was executed, but they never had corroborating evidence until now, when DNA confirmed he murdered her.
I know that she would be really happy to know that it's been closed. Just to know that Ted Bundy is like gnashing his teeth in hell.
Bundy was linked to the murders of at least 30 women and girls in the 1970s, though investigators have always believed there may have been even more.
In November of 1974, Ted Bundy sat alone in a police interview room in Utah. It had been weeks since 17-year-old Laura Ann Amy had vanished after stepping out into the night. Outside, the town had already begun to move on, the silence settling back into ordinary life. Inside, Bundy leaned back in his chair, calm, composed, answering questions with the kind of patience that disarms suspicion. Within years, investigators would begin to understand that this moment, this version of him, had already concealed far more than anyone in that room realized. What investigators would later uncover, and what you are about to understand, is not what most people think this case reveals. Before we go any further, there is something you need to understand about the central assumption surrounding cases like this, because the record will challenge it. And what we are about to examine will challenge it further still. The assumption is that the moment of violence is the crime, that everything builds to that point and ends there. But in this case, the evidence suggests something far more disturbing, something that begins long before and continues long after. In this investigation, we are going to trace the documented behavioral record surrounding the disappearance and murder of Laura Ann Amy. We are going to examine the timeline, the physical evidence, and the psychological pattern that investigators later connected to Bundy, and ask the question that most coverage about him has never directly asked. What actually happened in the time between her disappearance and her death? And what that answer reveals about him, about control, and about the nature of these crimes is not what most people expect. Spanish Fork, Utah in 1974 was, by most measures, an ordinary American town. Not untouched, not unfamiliar with hardship, just steady, a place where routines held, where the same roads were driven every day, and the same storefronts lit up the same quiet corners of the night. On Main Street, people knew where they were going before they left their homes. It was, in the language of the people who lived there, a place where nothing truly unexpected happened, a place where distance felt short and time felt predictable. It was also, as it would turn out, a place where one absence would not immediately disrupt the rhythm, at least not at first. There was a particular detail about Spanish Fork that rarely enters the retelling of this case. It sat at the intersection of familiarity and movement. People passed through, college towns nearby, highways stretching outward, just enough connection to the outside world that a stranger would not always be questioned, and just enough isolation that a disappearance could remain local before it became urgent. To live there was to feel safe in a way that did not require constant awareness. Doors were locked out of habit, not fear. Nights were quiet not because they were controlled, but because nothing had yet forced them to be otherwise. But there is something about this place, and this time, that is rarely examined alongside the case itself. And it matters, because what happened did not emerge from nowhere. The environment that allowed it had a history, a pattern of trust, a structure where movement was unremarkable, near where presence was not always accounted for, and that history is part of the story. Laura Ann Amy was 17 years old. She was, by every available account, present in her own life, engaged, social, aware of the world around her in the way someone that age begins to be. The people who knew her described someone who was comfortable among others, someone who moved easily between spaces, home, school, friends, without friction. There was nothing provisional about her life at that moment. Nothing unresolved. She had plans in the way most 17-year-olds do, not fully formed, but real enough to guide the next day, the next week. On October 31st, 1974, Laura attended a party in Spanish Fork. It was Halloween night, structured but informal, the kind of gathering where people arrive and leave without ceremony. At some point during the evening, she stepped away. The detail is simple. She was going to a nearby convenience store. It was not far. It did not require preparation. It did not suggest risk. By the time she left, nothing in the environment had shifted. Nothing indicated that this would be the last confirmed movement of her life. That expectation did not survive the week. At that point in the timeline, there was no documented relationship between Laura and the man investigators would later come to focus on. No known interaction, no established connection. What existed instead was absence, a gap where a person should have been, and the first attempts to understand the gap using the assumptions available at the time. A teenager leaves a party. She does not return. The initial framework is limited, possibility without direction. But there was one detail, small enough to be overlooked in the moment, that would later take on a different weight. The route. The short distance between where she was last seen and where she intended to go. A space that should have been uneventful. A movement that should have been completed. It is within that narrow stretch, between departure and arrival, that the first piece of the evidence trail begins, even if no one yet recognized it as such. Within days of her disappearance, investigators had very little. A timeline that ended too early. A location that offered no immediate answers. They had also, though they did not yet know it, the beginning of a pattern that would only become visible much later. What they were about to find in the days that followed would challenge everything the early investigation suggested. And the gap between what it appeared to be and what it actually was is where this case still lives. The report came in on the night of October 31st, 1974. A 17-year-old had not returned home. At first, it did not arrive with urgency. A delayed return, a missed check-in. The officers who responded treated it within the framework available to them. A young person last seen leaving a party, expected to return within a short window. There was no immediate sign of struggle, no confirmed witness to anything unusual. What they had was a timeline that ended at departure. By the next morning, that timeline had not extended. Friends were contacted, locations retraced. The convenience store she intended to walk to became a focal point, not because anything had been found there, but because it marked the last intended destination. Now, officers began mapping the distance between those 2 points. It was short, walkable, familiar. At that stage, the working assumption still allowed for voluntary absence. But one detail noted early and without emphasis would later return with weight. No confirmed sighting of her ever reaching that store. The movement had a beginning, but no documented middle and no end. Search efforts expanded outward. Within days, her body was discovered in a remote area outside Spanish Fork. The location altered the framework immediately. What had been treated as a disappearance became a homicide investigation. The scene suggested relocation. This was no longer about where she had gone. It was about where she had been taken. And then Ted Bundy entered the investigation. Not as a named suspect at the time, yes, but as a presence that would only later be understood. His initial interactions with law enforcement in that period were documented as controlled, cooperative, unremarkable on the surface. He spoke when spoken to. He presented himself without visible urgency. Investigators noted the consistency in his tone, the absence of contradiction in his immediate responses. They also noted something else, his proximity to environments similar to where victims had last been seen. What they did not yet know, and what he did not know they were beginning to track, was how those environments would begin to connect. As weeks turned into months, the evidence did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. Witness accounts from other locations. Reports of a man approaching young women under ordinary pretenses. The physical descriptions that began to align, not perfectly, but consistently enough to remain in consideration. Each piece on its own did not define a suspect, but together they began to form a pattern investigators could not ignore. During this period, Bundy continued to move through his life without disruption. He maintained appearances. He spoke when necessary. There was no single moment where the investigation closed in, only a gradual narrowing, a shift from possibility to direction, and then, eventually, to focus. By the time investigators began to formally connect cases across state lines, they had something they did not have at the beginning: behavioral consistency, a method, a type. It was enough to begin building a case framework. Owen Bundy, who had until that point existed within that framework as one of many possibilities, was about to be placed in a position where that pattern would be tested directly. When investigators later sat across from him, they were not starting from zero. They were carrying timelines, witness statements, geographic overlaps. They were not there to ask what had happened. They were there to observe how he would respond to what they already understood. And among the pieces they held, quietly without disclosure, was the one detail he could not account for: the emerging alignment between his movements and the moments where victims disappeared. Ted Bundy was, by most available measures, functional, a university student, politically engaged, capable of sustained conversation, structured work, and social interaction that did not immediately raise concern. He volunteered on crisis hotlines. He maintained relationships that on the surface followed expected patterns. The people who knew him described someone who could adapt his presentation to the room he was in: measured, attentive, often controlled in tone. There is nothing in the early record that investigators would later point to as an obvious, singular indicator, and that absence is part of the clinical picture. What does appear when the record is examined in sequence is inconsistency beneath that surface. Periods of stability followed by abrupt withdrawal. Relationships that appeared intact until they were not. A pattern of constructed identity, shifts in how he presented himself depending on context, without visible strain. These are not on their own diagnostic, but they form a behavioral history that, in retrospect, aligns with something more structured than randomness. But there is a pattern in the documented record that only becomes visible when you look at it through a clinical lens. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Psychopathy, as defined in clinical literature, is not simply a measure of violence. It is a constellation of traits: superficial charm, manipulativeness, shallow affect, lack of empathy, and a capacity for calculated control of others. In practical terms, it manifests as the ability to perform normalcy while remaining internally detached from the emotional consequences of one's actions. The documented record of Bundy's behavior contains multiple instances of this pattern: interactions where presentation and intent diverge completely. This is not a retrospective label applied after the fact. The indicators: behavioral consistency, emotional detachment, controlled interpersonal engagement, were present before the full scope of his crimes was understood. They were simply not the question anyone was asking at the time. One detail often misread in public accounts is composure. His calmness has been interpreted as confidence, or even intelligence in a conventional sense. Clinically, it aligns more closely with effective detachment, the absence of internal disruption where it would normally be expected. The ability to remain steady is not in this context a strength. It is a signal. In his own words, when he later spoke about himself, Bundy described a separation between who he appeared to be and what he was doing. Not as a contradiction, but as a managed reality. That distinction matters, because it suggests not confusion, but control. The gap between self-perception and behavior was not something he was attempting to resolve. It was something he was maintaining. The cognitive mechanism that allows for that is compartmentalization, the ability to isolate actions from identity to prevent one from altering the perception of the other. It is what makes sustained performance possible. It is also what makes that performance difficult to disrupt under ordinary questioning, because the individual is not experiencing conflict in the way an investigator might expect. There is no internal pressure to relieve, only a structure to maintain. Everything we have just established, the psychological framework, the documented behavioral history, the gap between how he presented himself and what the evidence would later show, was about to be tested in a room where none of it could be managed perfectly, because the evidence was already in the room. And what he did in the minutes that followed, what he chose to say, chose not to say, and chose to perform, is a case study investigators still examine today. And we are about to go inside it. Ted Bundy entered the room at a time when the investigation had already moved beyond uncertainty. The setting was controlled. Investigators present, notes prepared, a sequence already decided before he arrived. The first thing they documented was not what he said, but how he settled. He did not hesitate at the threshold. He sat, adjusted his posture, and oriented himself toward the conversation as though it were routine. In the first minutes, he answered questions directly without visible strain, maintaining a steady tone and consistent pacing. This is consistent with the psychopathy framework established earlier, the capacity to perform normalcy under scrutiny, to construct a behavioral baseline that appears stable enough to discourage immediate escalation. Investigators noted it. They did not challenge it yet. They were establishing what normal looked like for him in that room. He presented himself as cooperative. His statements followed a structure, clear, contained, and deliberately limited to what was asked. There was no expansion beyond the boundaries of the question, no volunteered detail. This, too, is consistent. Under pressure, the strategy is not to dominate the conversation, but to control its edges, to answer without revealing, and to remain inside the frame provided. And then, after a shift in questioning, subtle but intentional, there was a change. It did not announce itself. It appeared first in timing, a delay before answering, slight but measurable, then in language. When asked directly about proximity to environments connected to the case, he responded with controlled distance, acknowledging the possibility of being near without confirming presence. In documented statements, this pattern repeats. The language avoids commitment. Behaviorally, that matters. In authentic recollect flexibility, it preserves the ability to adjust the narrative later without contradiction. It is not confusion. It is management. Then the evidence entered the room. Not all movement patterns that, when placed side by side, reduce the space available for ambiguity. When it was presented, the record notes a pause, longer than before. His posture shifted, slightly forward, then back. His response when it came was controlled, but narrower. Fewer words. More care and selection. The psychopathy framework predicts the maintenance of composure. It does not predict what happens when the available narrative space begins to close. Here is where the confrontation changed. Because the evidence did not produce collapse, it produced adaptation. He did not withdraw. He recalibrated. He acknowledged fragments. He adjusted phrasing. He attempted to align his account with the edges of what had been presented, it without stepping into direct confirmation. And in doing so, he revealed something else. Not the full structure, but the effort required to maintain it. As questioning continued, the strategy became more difficult to sustain. Investigators noted increased pauses, a repetition of phrases, a return to previously used language, as though cycling through prepared constructs. The performance did not break, but it began to show repetition. And repetition, in this context, is a constraint. It indicates a limited set of available responses being reused under pressure. There was no singular moment where he confessed, no definitive break that resolved the confrontation in real time. What emerged instead was a layered record, a baseline of control, a deviation under pressure, a pattern of language that avoided anchoring, and a behavioral shift when evidence reduced the available space for that avoidance. What the room revealed clinically is precise. It confirms the presence of controlled interpersonal engagement. It confirms adaptive narrative management under increasing cognitive load. It confirms the absence of effective disruption where it would typically be expected. What it does not confirm on an operative individual and what it actually documented, a structured adaptive performance under pressure, is where its value lies. Because that record did not end in that room. It became part of something larger, something that would continue to build, piece by piece, washed beyond the limits of what any single conversation could establish. What happened inside that confrontation is now fixed in the investigative record. What happened next is where the case moves beyond behavior and into consequence. Because the room is not the end, it is evidence. And evidence, as he was about to learn, does not remain contained to the moment in which it is observed. By the time Ted Bundy stood before the court, the legal frame had narrowed. The charges were precise, multiple counts tied to abduction and homicide across jurisdictions, each requiring the prosecution to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This was not a case built on a single moment, but on accumulation. The prosecution's burden was not only to present evidence, but to connect it geographically, behaviorally, and temporally into a structure the court could recognize as definitive. The defense strategy, in contrast, focused on fragmentation, to separate the pieces, to challenge the continuity the prosecution was attempting to construct. They questioned the reliability of witness identifications. They scrutinized timelines. They examined the handling of physical evidence, not always to disprove it entirely, but to introduce doubt into its interpretation. This was a case where the absence of direct observation in key moments created space, and the defense used that space deliberately. The prosecution's case unfolded in sequence. Witness testimony came first. Individual accounts that, on their own, appeared limited, but together began to align. Then physical evidence. Then behavioral evidence. Patterns of movement. Consistency across incidents. And in the documented record of interaction with investigators. The confrontation itself, while not presented as proof of guilt, was introduced as context, demonstrating controlled responses under pressure and the narrowing of narrative flexibility when faced with structured evidence. One witness in particular carried weight. A survivor who identified Bundy and described the method of approach. That testimony did not stand alone, but it anchored the pattern the prosecution was building. And then, at a point where the structure appeared cohesive, the defense introduced its central complication. The argument that alignment is not equivalence, that similarity across cases does not establish identity within them. It required the court to consider not only what the evidence showed, but what it could not conclusively prove on its own. When it slowed the momentum, it forced precision. The defense's most effective moments came in those margins, in highlighting inconsistencies that did not collapse the case, but complicated it, in emphasizing the absence of direct forensic confirmation in certain instances, limitations that, at the time, could not be resolved with the tools available. Bundy's own presentation during the trial remained consistent with the psychological framework already established: controlled, engaged when necessary, detached where expected. He did not display visible escalation as the case against him was constructed. The performance held. On the day the verdict was returned, Laura Ann Amey's family were present. They had sat through the proceedings, through the reconstruction of events that reduced a life to evidence. The jury delivered its decision: guilty. And the response in the room was contained, but not empty. Relief in its most restrained form. A confirmation that what had been argued, piece by piece, had met the standard required. Her family and statements afterward spoke not in abstraction, but in recognition of her life, of the fact that the system had reached a conclusion where she could no longer speak for herself. Bundy's response, as documented, did not deviate. No visible collapse, no outward acknowledgement beyond the procedural. The clinical framework would predict this. Effective detachment does not resolve at the moment of consequence. It persists, and in that persistence, it offers one final data point. The verdict confirms in legal terms that the evidence presented met the threshold required for conviction. It establishes responsibility within the framework of the law. What it does not confirm, what it cannot, is the full internal architecture of why. The psychology remains partially inferred, constructed from behavior, from pattern, from record. The gap between legal conclusion and clinical understanding remains. And within that gap, one question persists. Not whether he did it, the end of the trial. It was not the end of that question, because what followed, the years beyond the courtroom, the environment that replaced it, the conditions that no longer required performance in the same way, is where that psychology is tested differently. And it is where this investigation ultimately moves next. Ted Bundy was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, he was held within the Florida prison system, primarily on death row at Florida State Prison, a maximum security facility designed for permanent containment. The structure is controlled, repetitive, and intentionally restrictive. Movement is limited, contact is regulated, time is measured not in events, but in routine. What research on long-term high-security confinement identifies is not a single psychological outcome, but a pattern: compression of external identity, increased reliance on internal narrative, and in some cases, a sharpening rather than a reduction of pre-existing traits. For a psychological profile structured around control, detachment, and compartmentalization, the expectation is not collapse. It is persistence. The environment removes opportunity. It does not necessarily alter structure. There is a question the sentence, even those acknowledgments were controlled, often framed through explanation rather than reflection. The psychological indicators remain consistent with the framework already established. There was no clear shift toward emotional congruence, no sustained departure from the pattern of managed presentation. What confinement reveals in this case is not transformation, but continuity. The same architecture, control, compartmentalization, detachment, remains visible even when the environment no longer rewards it. Research supports this. Personality structures of this kind tend to stabilize over time rather than dissolve, particularly in conditions where external variables are minimized. And outside of that system, Laura Ann Amy is remembered not as a case, but as a person. By those who knew her, she remains 17, present in memory in a way the legal record cannot fully capture. Her life did not become defined by what happened to her, but it was altered permanently in how it is told. That distinction matters because the case carries her name, but the life behind that name existed long before it. We have now been inside this case at every level the record allows. We have seen the investigation. We have watched the confrontation. We have examined the trial and the sentence. We have seen what the aftermath produced. What we have not yet done, what we have been building towards since the first frame, is answer the question this documentary began with. What actually happened in the time between her disappearance and her death? And what the complete record reveals in response is not simple, but it is precise, and it is the only answer the evidence supports. The investigation, the confrontation, the behavioral record, taken together, documented a pattern of controlled interaction, adaptive language under pressure, and a consistent narrowing of narrative when evidence reduced available ambiguity. What that confirms is precise, that Ted Bundy maintained a structured behavioral strategy when confronted with investigative pressure, and that this strategy showed measurable strain when specific evidence was introduced. What it cannot confirm, and what no behavioral analysis alone could confirm, is not whether he was responsible. The evidence answers that. On the more important question, the one this entire analysis has been building toward, is this. What does control actually look like in real time when it is being maintained under pressure? And the answer, as the complete record shows, is not dramatic. It is incremental. It appears in delays, in word choices, in what is avoided rather than what is said. It is visible, but only if you know where to look. The psychological record, from early history through post-verdict behavior, supports a consistent structure. Traits associated with psychopathy, detachment, compartmentalization, controlled presentation, remain stable across environments. What can be said with support is that this structure did not collapse under consequence. What cannot be said with certainty is the full extent of internal awareness or subjective experience behind it. And the record shows behavior. It does not grant access to internal state. The most reliable finding this case supports is continuity, that the same psychological architecture visible before the crimes remained visible after them, unchanged in its core function. At the level of the system, this case reveals both precision and limitation. Investigatively, the eventual use of forensic evidence, particularly DNA, demonstrates the system's capacity to correct what time obscured. It connected what could not be connected in 1974. It resolved what could not then be proven. That is what the system got right, but it also reveals what the system could not address in real time. The gap between disappearance and identification, the delay between pattern and recognition, the limitations of available tools at the moment they were needed most. This case exists, in part, because of that gap. And at the center of every piece of evidence we have examined, every behavioral analysis, every investigative step, every clinical framework, is Laura Ann Amy, 17 years old, present in her life, moving through a night that, by every expectation available to her, should have ended the way it began. The investigation exists because she existed first. The analysis exists because Something was taken from that life that cannot be restored by evidence, by verdict, or by understanding.